All right, everybody, we should be live for another developer interview here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am Josh Placer, and we have another great chat for you this afternoon. My guest is from Kitfox Games, who he was the lead on the Shattered Isle. We actually spoke with him a few years ago about that, and he's currently working on their recently announced game Lucifer Within Us. So please welcome back to the cast, Jongwoo. How are you doing?
Doing great, thanks, Josh.
It's great to have you back on. How is everything treating you this very hectic and crazy summer?
Yeah, it's definitely not what any of us were expecting, but I mean, at the same time, I don't know, being stuck indoors does allow us to just focus on development and getting the project finished and into the hands of fans. So, pretty excited about that.
Yeah. And it is great to have you back on. Like I said, we last spoke when you were working on the Shattered Isle, which was a very interesting and kind of different game from Kitfox. And it sounds like Lucifer is going to be along those lines of being another very unique property for you.
That's absolutely right. There are certain like a design. I guess, the motifs, if you will, that carry forward from one project to the next. But whereas the Shattered Isle was very much a management simulation type of game, the Lucifer Within Us is much more of a mystery-solving game that focuses on testimonies, exorcism.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for the people watching us right now, live or recorded, who haven't heard about it yet, could you give us kind of the elevator pitch for Lucifer?
So Lucifer Within Us is a player-directed mystery-solving game in which you play as a digital exorcist in a futuristic theocracy. So this is a world in which tech and spirituality continues to develop together for a long period of time. And so there is no meaningful difference between the digital and the spiritual. And it's a world in which there hasn't been a murder in 100 years. And then one day, suddenly, someone is killed in this abbey. And you, as an exorcist, Sister Ada, are sent to investigate what happened and cover the truth behind the event. And the project comes from a certain desire to push forward the mystery-solving genre in games. So some of my favorite games are, for example, Phoenix Wright or L.A. Noire and such. But what I found when playing those games was that fundamentally they're rooted in a certain, like a linear structure that's bound by the type of stories that the developer was trying to tell. And so as a player, I didn't feel as though I was able to actually investigate the crime And so in Lucifer Within Us, you are the investigator. The game will place you at the crime scene, and you interrogate suspects and hear their testimonies. And it will be played out in real time in 3D according to what they tell you.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, that is subjective and full of omissions or outright. And so by comparing testimonies against each other and against the physical evidence, you uncover the truth of what happened and discover what demon may be possessing the culprit and motive to kill the victim.
Mm. And I think what you said about kind of like the mystery genre is I think that could definitely be a fascinating discussion to have, because like you, I've played Phoenix Wright. What was the one? I played stuff like the Shape-Shifting Detective, Infectious Madness of Dr. Decker, like the FMV style mystery games.
Yeah.
And
right.
There's always, I think that's always been one of the limitations of something like these kinds of games, is, as you said, they're often designed around a linear experience, that, the killer will always be the killer at the end of the story. Once you've gone through it once, there really isn't that, motivation to replay it a second or third time.
Right. And so with regard to that, so Lucifer Within Us, it does have an overarching narrative, and it's not as though the game is infinitely replayable or anything like that. But my focus for this project, as far as pushing forward on the edges of mystery game design, if you will, it was as far as if you are the investigator, you should be trusted to solve the crime your way, like when you discover the information, and be able to finish the case, make the accusation when you feel ready to do so. Whereas, in a game like Phoenix Wright, for example, because they need to save a certain dramatic twist for when the court scenes happen, or they need this character to appear at a certain moment. There's actually many cases in which I felt like I already see the conceit of the case and wish Phoenix would see it so that we can just bring this in. But the game has to go on, the show goes on, and I can't do anything about that.
Yeah.
And so even though there is a certain objective truth, like a true timeline, if you will, of events that happens in a given case in Lucifer Within Us, as far as your investigation of that particular case, it is directed by you. The game doesn't prevent you from gaining any information that as long as the suspects aren't being intentionally uncooperative. So they will lie to you, and they will not give you the information at the beginning. But other than that, there's nothing that is restricted from you, and by carefully observing and deducing the true timeline of events, you are able to force them to speak the truth and uncover the truth for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And I think, as you're describing this game, my mind goes back to something like The Return of the Obra Dinn. I really did. I think of the games that I've played, that's probably my favorite in terms of just really letting. It's so much focus on the player deducing the game, and I think similar to what you're saying with Lucifer, there is a strict narrative, there is a story to this game, just as there is with Return of the Obra Dinn, but it's up. You're kind of putting it on the player to actually, deduce what's going on.
Absolutely. And so, a comparison with Return of the Obra Dinn is interesting in that, the way Return of the Obra Dinn is structured, there is a central book of questions and answers, if you will. And so long as you answer those, it doesn't really care which order you do so. And, it even allows you to make, temporary guesses until, the answer gets locked down.
Mm-hmm.
But they handle it. The game handles it in terms of snapshots at certain moments. These are objective snapshots at this moment in time, and then you're free to see that snapshot of the past from multiple angles, if you will. But again, they are snapshots. Whereas Lucifer Within Us is about continuum, a subjective continuum. If someone gives you a testimony, it stretches from the beginning of the events of the crime to the end when the body is discovered or someone is arrested. And so there's a certain, I guess it's a focus on depth focus on fewer characters and tighter space. Whereas I would say that Obra Dinn's approach has a much larger cast for. Mm-hmm. And spans the entirety of the ship and the adventures of this crew and and the passengers in this mysterious journey. So it's a very two very distinct approaches to examining the past, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So with Lucifer Within Us, I was looking at some of the screenshots and some of the descriptions of it. What is kind of the general gameplay of the title? What is someone going to be doing when they start playing?
It's an excellent question, and part of it is observation, as I was describing earlier. When a suspect gives you a testimony, it is visualized in real time, and as you compare one person's testimony against the other, against those of others, you will discover certain discrepancies, and you can point out those discrepancies in a similar way to Phoenix Wright's contradiction system. and the suspect will amend their testimony if you discover those. But as far as other interactions you do in the game, you're able to ask about just about anything that you find. So if a given suspect's testimony sections feels suspicious, feel free to just press them more about it. Just ask them, and they'll say it. They may elaborate, or they may just try to dismiss whatever questions you might be asking them. Or you can ask them about other characters' testimony segments, and in which they may verify or dispute what that character claims to have been doing. And even for physical evidence, if you find something, you can present it to a character. So it's intended to be relatively free-form. I like to use the term player-directed in the sense that you're directing the investigation. The information you have is the basis for how the case moves forward and how you choose to make it move forward.
Okay. And you said earlier the game is played in real time, right?
In a sense. Okay. So the game is structured in such a way that, so it is not an action game by any means. It is meant to be a thoughtful and analytical game. But the testimonies are they can be fully controlled by you as far as which section you see and how the speed at which it's being played out in front of you. So you can scrub to any moment in a suspect's timeline to really scrutinize what happened. With the caveat that it is subjective reconstruction, of course. Mm-hmm. And because everything has happened in the past, the present is locked in a sense. So the physical evidence from those events will be there based on the objective true events. And so it is meant to be kind of in the mystery genre, there's the thing about the what's the term? Closed room mysteries or something like that, if you will. So it's meant to be a certain puzzle box that is set, but with the complexity of multiple conflicting testimonies about it.
Okay. And I guess with the kind of design of the game, and I'm not sure this would be considered a spoiler or not, is the ending of the game, I guess, quote unquote, fixed each time you play it, or is the player able to alter, or is it somewhat malleable?
That's an excellent question. And so the ending of Lucifer Within Us and the overarching plot that ties everything together is fixed. I originally wanted the game to have more of branching paths or branching outcomes based on how you've solved or what you claim to be true about a given case. But it expanded the possibility space almost too much, as far as allowing the player or allowing the game systems even to meaningfully verify true or false. And so the overall, as far as are there variant outcomes in the overarching narrative, there isn't. But within a given case, how you solve it, how you get to the end, is largely player driven.
Okay. So the game is going to be set up to have. It's not going to be just one murder. It's going to be multiple cases within a single play.
That's absolutely right. So there's going to be 3 cases in the game, and each case is structured in such a way that they are somewhat self-contained. There are links between each of the cases, but something that's frustrating me as a player in the past is if the final case of the game is entirely dependent on certain knowledge about something that happened in a previous cases. And so as a result, the actual design or the events of the final case become somewhat stilted, since there's so much pressure based on the narrative element. So we took pains to ensure that each case is standalone. Yes, there are sometimes returning characters, or there are things that would be enriched if you play them in order. But each one is designed in such a way that all the information that you need to solve it. Case.
Okay. Yeah, because as you were describing the case structure, it reminded me of the adventure game I played. I think it was a Lamplight City. I had the developer on, I think, a few weeks ago, Francisco. Cool. I forget his last name.
Yeah.
And for that game, it allowed you to you could actually fail the cases,
Right,
and
right.
still move forward in the overarching story of it.
Right. And so that's... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, like, with Lucifer, is it, like, are you, I guess, quote unquote, required to solve the case, or can it end with you just completely, whiffing and just like not doing it right, and still moving on to the next one?
Right. So in the current game, current version of the game, you are required to solve the case before moving on to the next one. And part of the decision to go with that with that design as opposed to what you've mentioned about Lamplight City, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that there, as interesting it is from a structural perspective to have the player fail to solve something, the overall value of that to the player experience felt minimal compared to the amount of the cost that would involve for like supporting. Hey, like what happens if you fail this case and didn't solve it? Like in many cases, the players will want to go back and solve the case correctly, if you will, anyway. And so, in that regard, even though perhaps like the ideal version, it would have been nice for the player failure to just be pushed forward, to be embraced and then move forward. Having meaningful consequences for that, and also having a still satisfying narrative arc at the end in the grand scheme of things was difficult to balance with that. So we went for mandatory solve for it at the end of the case. Sure.
Okay. I guess with coming up with the actual cases themselves or with the structure, like I've had a chance like to interview a few developers who work on like the mystery genre. I guess what was your approach to like building these cases? Again, you don't have to go into any like story details or spoilers, but just kind of like your overall philosophy for designing these cases.
For sure. So I mentioned the contrast between Return of the Obra versus Lucifer Within Us, and that in some ways that they Return of the Obra focuses on like the breadth and like snapshots. So they have a huge cast of characters and like just moments in time, whereas we are able to focus deeply into like a couple characters. And so like there's almost like a similarity to I guess stage productions, if you will, of like with a small cast. Like a given case will have 2 suspects or 3 suspects, and all the primary actions that happen in that case and the meaningful relationships in that case need to be encompassed by 2 characters. And so there were a couple like points for like a starting points. A couple of principles for like as a starting point for a given case. So the space was paramount. The space needed to be interesting from a mystery solving perspective because the characters are depicted in a continuous. And so where they move, what they do, and what they hide needed to be interesting from like an investigator looking at it in the present without having full information in order for the case to move forward, like as far as the design. Another one was having a very, very clear motive for the keys for the actual culprit, and there didn't need to be like a too much. I guess like there didn't need to be like a super detailed backstory per se, as much as like is there a key emotion or like a key idea that drove one character might kill the victim, and given the some of the narrative themes of the game, we were able to tie these to the 7 deadly sins. And so each of the case murders, the murderers and motives tie somewhat into one of the 7, and that helped to distinguish each of the cases from each other. Because since the desire is different, the means become different, and as a result, we were able to have like a variety of cases. The final one though, is just in terms of like interesting lines. And I guess it ties somewhat back to that what I said about like that focus on space. But at least for the culprit, and somewhat less so for the characters who are other suspects, but not the culprit themselves, they need to be able to tell visibly different lines about what happened, and the truth of what happened needs to be more interesting than the initial line. And that initial line needs to be vague enough to be suspicious, but also plausible enough that the player will need to work at it to discover why there's a contradiction in what was said. And so it was a bit of a balancing act. In truth, I wish that I don't know, like at some level, because we are depicting the characters fully in 3D, there were certain shortcuts that, like, if we were depicting them in like in a style that was more abstract or symbolic instead, that we could have gotten away with. That we can't do it because they're depicted continuously, and we have to show their actions at any moment in time. Yeah. At the same time, there's like a certain I guess commitment to realism, as far as, or like a verisimilitude rather than, if you will, because it is continuous, because a character literally has to walk somewhere to do that thing, whereas like in other media they would just cut to the character doing that thing, you know. So like in some ways there's a certain tightness of design because the killer could have only done it this way, or like if the killer didn't do it this way, there's good reasons why it would be physically impossible. So,
and I think that also kind of gets back to kind of distinguishing it from the Shrouded Isle, where that game was very much abstracted. You kind of kept with a lot of still imagery. You know, you didn't have to show everything. You kind of let the player's imagination run with kind of the descriptions and the scenes. But as you said,
sorry, go ahead,
I was just saying, but with something like this, as you said, like, you're letting the player view the entire timeline of a course of events. Everything has to be kind of, kept grounded in that aspect.
For sure. And so with regard to grounding and like implicit versus explicit information, something that we ran into very early in development was just how much players trusted certain pieces of information versus not. And so like any given piece of text that the player reads in the game, there's a certain like implicit trust in the veracity of what's written there, and so like even if like a certain detail was added for as a flair just to improve the player's experience rather than like being a meaningful clue for solving the case, depending on the player, they might have seen that as a subtle but critical piece of the puzzle and seek the information that that piece implies. And if it doesn't exist in the game, they will spend a lot of time looking for something that doesn't exist. And so there needed to be like some level of consistency between the multiple types of information that is in the game, but also certain judiciousness about how many things we add to a given game. And so like there's a temptation to add a lot of red herrings because it will increase the difficulty and the to some degree just the aesthetics of a given case, but it also hampers the solvability to a large extent. And even if you pare down a case down to just its critical information, like often that is still relatively complex and difficult for a player to solve. And so, like, I mean, yes, there are, like, we did end up adding a few red herrings to the different cases, but what we discovered is that largely that is not necessary and may harm the player experience even.
Yeah. I guess, continue with that line there. In terms of, I guess, the player's side of things, like, normally with some of these games, they can be very, I guess, as you said, they can be very railroaded. The game will say, this guy is suspicious, you should click here, or, something is wrong, compare these two. In terms of, I guess, how open, or maybe how free-form the player is able to kind of deduce these things, I guess, how are you approaching that with Lucifer?
So, as open as we can possibly make. And other than the tutorial at the beginning of the game, it is pretty open. So I mentioned earlier that other than the uncooperative suspects, the investigation is open for the player, right? So like any sort of physical evidence, there's nothing stopping you from gathering. And as far as like accusing someone, if you really think you have all the evidence required to accuse somebody, you can accuse them from the get-go. But the way our system works, when you accuse someone and it's invalid for a reason that the suspect can express, then they will make a counterclaim and explain why that couldn't have been valid for them. Like whether it's because they were elsewhere or they didn't have access to that the object that you're claiming is the means of the murder, or whether like you think that this motive would explain why they killed the victim. And so in a sense, like the game tries to allow the player to investigate the mystery space, if you will, as they wish, based on whatever information that they have. It will never force you to make an accusation. It will never force you to make a contradiction. But on the end, the opposite is also true as far as you will never be locked out of a critical contradiction or accusation because the story hasn't progressed far. It's up to you to find the information required to push the case forward.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about pushing the case forward, I also want to ask you about, does Lucifer have any punishment or, I guess, fail states in it? Because if you remember from Phoenix Wright, during the interrogation or the cross-examination, 3 strikes and, the case ends immediately.
Yeah, right, yeah. My response to that is that there is no punishment for failing or a contradiction or accusation or anything like that. So, like in the harshest sense, like there is no game over state in Lucifer Within Us. And it was an interesting path to that led us to choosing that design option, because part of me does wish that. As much as I guess certain other genres are able to train players to be better, whatever the problem space is for that genre, I wish that were true for mystery games. And one good way to do that is by having a very, very clear fail state. Mm-hmm. At the same time, because of the particulars related to mystery game design. So, if, for example, you mentioned, Phoenix failing, just losing the case because he said the wrong thing 3 times, right? Well, I mean, but why? Are you dying? I mean, they straight up show you a life bar, but the ludonarrative dissonance related to traditional fail states in mystery games is something that I personally dislike immensely. And so what I wanted to do initially was to have the player get much more clear feedback about why that immediate action that they took, whether let's say presenting a piece, contradicting someone with a piece of evidence, is wrong. And so that's to some extent that's why the counterclaim dialogues exist in the game, so that there's some feedback from the game to the player that this conclusion that you made, while interesting, is flawed for certain reasons. But then there's only so much that can be done without literally reading the player's mind and intent, or asking the player to clearly express what their intent was when doing so. And so, in that regard, having a very clear or like a cost or punishment just didn't seem appropriate for the game. And so you are able to take as long as you wish, and you can be as wrong as you want. The game will not stop. The game will not cause you to fail. And for some people, perhaps that's dissatisfying, or like it encourages. What's the term? This is clicking on everything, if you will. At the same time, though, like, I mean, if someone is okay with engaging the game that way, then as a developer, I'm not particularly concerned about it. What I am more interested in is allowing the players who do want to make those logical leaps and who do want to take certain risks and solve the case their way, and allowing them to feel satisfied when they see something that is not, and not punishing them for being too smart in certain cases. Seeing something that that might be that is like a very nuanced interpretation, but the game just had no way to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's kind of like one of those limitations from Phoenix Wright, as you mentioned as well, because I remember a few of those cases where, like you said, I figured it out. I knew, this person killed him so and so, but because the game wouldn't let me make that right connection, or I couldn't get that connection because the game didn't allow me to do it, we had to kind of like spin our wheels for like a few extra minutes. And
for sure.
It is very tricky, I think, for these kinds of games, because as we've said, there's always there's that balance you have to run between, let the player, deduce everything they want, but you're still telling a fixed story with an established beginning, middle, and end to it.
Sorry, I couldn't catch the last part there.
I'm sorry, I guess my headset must have cut out. What I was saying was that there's always that push and pull between whether giving the player complete freedom, but also working with that established, there must be a beginning, a middle, and an end to this narrative.
Right. And definitely, if I've understood you right, giving the player as much freedom as possible, within certain expectations of the genre, whether it is in other media or just specifically to mystery games, is a difficult line to toe. And I guess from our perspective, it's something like there's so many mystery games that are very much bound by narrative structures and beats, and as a result rob the player the opportunity to really be the investigator in a game that's supposed to be about investigating. And so I guess I wanted to make a game in which the player, as much as possible within a certain mystery case, are able to try and solve and figure things out without the game prompting them. Mm-hmm. And I think to some degree, until we have a much more sophisticated input systems or interpretation systems, at least on the games end for you mentioned FMV games earlier, Dr. Necker, for example, but it's still very much keyword based, right? If it actually was able to parse meaningful statements, what you are claiming, what you're hypothesizing, then that would help really recreate the experience of being the investigator and seeing what's there and trying to reason things out. But given that that level of technology is not available, or at least not widely available, it seems. I took an approach of making things as open-ended as possible between the beginning and the end of the case. When you're actually doing the investigation steps and when you're actually trying to figure out what happened. And as a result, I think we're able to maintain a balance between certain player desire to see a overarching conspiracy or mystery, but also empowering the player to investigate as they do.
And Shark asked in chat, I think we kind of answered this one already, but can you just blame everyone right at the start and still finish the case? Like, can you just accuse everybody?
You can try to accuse everybody, but I mentioned the counterclaim system earlier. Right? So when you try to do that and you put in random answers, or I mean, like in some cases it may well be valid answers. If it's valid, they will accept for that section anyway. So if you find a valid opportunity in which this suspect could have done something, you can do it. If you can find a valid weapon that they could have used, that you can do it. But because there's one objective underlying truth to the events, ultimately the only way to have a successful accusation is to understand and solve the case. So yes, you can accuse anybody and keep trying to accuse everybody from the beginning, and you will get some interesting information that way because of the counterclaims. But you will still have to solve the case to successfully accuse somebody.
Okay. And I think, like, going back to what you were saying a minute ago regarding, like, the evolution of, like, the text parser and kind of, like, the player's own interaction mechanics, there's definitely, I think, a greater discussion there about ways of letting the player kind of interact or manipulate the world. And yeah, I remember I spoke with Tim from Diavecchi about Dr. Decker. I think this was about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and we spoke about that kind of text parser interface. And like, no matter how open or how freeform you make it, it's still very much an input-output mechanism. You can have somebody say, like, you can say the right thing, but if you didn't say it in the correct way or the way the computer understands it, the illusion, kind of breaks there.
For sure. I mean, like, while the illusion exists, it's amazing. It feels like it just understands what you're saying, but as soon as you get past it even the slightest way, it can be frustrating very quickly. And so that actually ties back to what I was saying about the implicit information earlier and, again, red herrings. You could see red herrings are really talking about misleading possibilities, right? And so, like, the player sees this possibility space for whatever reason, based on the way you present the case and whatever else they bring into the experience. So, and in order to solve the case, they have to find the correct cluster or the correct spot in that possibility space. And so, the more that the game system allows for a nominally that, but as far as the output or the response, very, very narrow possible, the more that illusion you were talking about will break. And so, FMV games, especially FMV games with parsers, are especially prone because FMVs are fixed content with high cost, and so you can only have so many clips. And even if you try to cover all the interesting ones, inevitably the player's creativity will break it. And in the ideal situation, there should be synergy with the player's creativity and not dissonance. And so, to bring this back to Lucifer for a second, the reason why the free asking system that I mentioned earlier exists in the game is it's intended to be something of a compromise between the problems of the parser, but also the desire to keep it as open as possible. And so, in Phoenix Wright, as much as I love the game, often you have this huge inventory of stuff, and some of them is pretty damning information, actually. Yeah. and the suspects that are that you're talking to are acting very suspiciously, and you really wish you could ask them about this. You really wish you could ask them about that, or what they were saying just earlier, but I can't access right now. And so by allowing the player to ask about anything that they discover, it does bridge the gap between the intent of a free text parser and the certainty and the satisfaction of the discrete presentation systems of something like Phoenix Wright.
Yeah, I just love like I have the murder weapon, but I can't tell anyone about
Yeah,
it.
exactly. And the judge doesn't care either
Yeah.
because, like, that's not the question that's being asked.
Judge, I have the
Uh,
murder weapon right here.
yeah.
No, I don't care about
And,
that.
and so, like, about that, so another aspect to this openness that Lucifer is trying to accomplish is that so the accusations in the game will always ask for three things: the opportunity, the means, and the motive. The classic elements of an accusation in a mystery. And this was very important for grounding the cases and the project, because what often happens in an entirely narrative structure focused mystery games is that to preserve a certain twist and to preserve like a certain dramatic beat, they will hide the meaningful questions of a case until that very moment, or like hide the evidence or information related to that until like a different character brings it up and proves you wrong, essentially. And so for Lucifer Within Us, in a given case, those are the three things ultimately. Can you show me that the suspect, like when the suspect could have done it? Can you show me how the suspect could have done it? Can you show me why the suspect would have done it? And that helps ensure that there is a certain fairness, a certain promise to the player that the questions of the case aren't going to be changed or pulled out beneath you, and like maybe the actual complexity of how the murder happened, that will change as you uncover new information, and that's great and that's satisfying. But still, you are still asking about how the murder happened, as opposed to suddenly asking like what was in the safe of the victim's like in the victim's office or something like that. Because you weren't thinking about that at all, perhaps, until the game asked you, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so that tied in with the openness of the asking system, or the physical evidence discovery and the timeline navigation, really comes together to let the player investigate based on what they know and what they want to find.
And speaking about kind of the investigation side of things, I was looking on the Steam page and I saw that there's a mention, of course, no QTs, no mini games, no action sequences like that. And that was another thing Phoenix Wright introduced into the layer entries, was these kinds of little mini games. You had to break,
right.
I think mental locks on people.
Right.
And
so yes, sir, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, with designing Lucifer, were there any times you thought about having more action or more subsystems, or did you kind of settle very quickly on this kind of investigation and timeline system?
Right, that's an interesting question. I guess as far as action gameplay, that was decided against relatively early on, and my pet peeve is when there is a chase sequence for no reason, or I don't know, there's aim the God knows what to hit the target, or whatever. And the most egregious example of a game that does that is Sherlock Holmes' Crimes and Punishments. And I like the game generally, but it almost seemed as though they didn't think Sherlock or solving crimes was interesting enough for players, and so they added all these other things to pad out the experience at the expense of making the cases themselves more interesting, or the actions involved in investigation more interesting. And so action mini games are definitely not in there from the beginning. And as far as unlocking and that, this was a kind of a gray zone. On one hand, the metaphor of unlocking something is kind of fits well together with the mystery game. And during early phases of development, there was definitely a lot of suggestions about, hey, why don't we just lock this critical a piece of evidence behind, in a hidden room or in a safe or something like that. And and I think like, in some version of some alternate version of the game, we may have done it. But my view on it, on something like that, was if it's gonna be locked, then it should be locked during the events of the case to illustrate why it's relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like like you discovering someone's I don't know, like hidden stash in a safe. That's like while like maybe that might elucidate something about their motives. Like that's far less interesting than if someone hid the murder weapon during the case, and you could see that they actually interacted with the safe and whatnot. But then that adds a layer in which the player should be unable to open the safe until they make that connection, right?
I'm sorry.
So, like,
I'm sorry to interrupt
the,
you. You kind of like cut out there as you were describing the save, like the.
Okay. Okay. So I mean, just to, I guess I'll just quickly summarize as far as like a lockpick mechanics. Like, we decided against it because ultimately, as the investigator, you should have full access to the crime scene, right? There wasn't a meaningful way to lock that information out of the player other than for the sake of having like a lock picking mini game, and that's such a common trope in games that and it felt unnecessary. And it was like if we were able to just like make the case design more cohesive, that felt like the more interesting choice than arbitrarily locking a critical piece of information in a safe. And so, like in that regard, in the final game, there really isn't any mini games whatsoever. I think, like if the principle was essentially this: if we were going to add a mechanic to the game, it should be presented in a way that that the player can use it as a tool anywhere that they wish, as opposed to activate it in a very, very particular circumstance. And so, one example of something that we were trying to do but was cut was there was a linkage system between evidence. So if there's like a relational information between two pieces of evidence, let's say like a character's information and like a particular weapon, there would be a link between that character and the weapon that they might have used. But it added certain expressiveness to the game, and that it makes it very clear what is a valid relationship versus not. But it added a certain level of complexity that eventually was proven to be cumbersome, and we cut that. And so, like, if we were to like expand on the game and its mechanics, it might be that we might some sort of new interaction that isn't there right now. So I don't know, like maybe some sort of physical investigation requiring a specialized tool to discover like fingerprints or something. But then it wouldn't be available just for a particular case in a particular situation. It would be available globally, and it's up to you to decide, hey, I want to use the fingerprint scanner and see if there are fingerprints on this object.
Versus a game just saying, there are fingerprints, you must now use this little mini game.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, like, as you're describing that, it kind of reminds me of, like, Lucifer, 10, 15 years ago could have been very much like those old school, like the LucasArts or Sierra Adventure games where, I need an important clue, it's behind this locked door, I need to go solve, some crazy puzzle to then get that clue to then prove this was a murder, even though I already knew that to be going into it, essentially.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And I think, like, to your other point about kind of having these little mini games and subsystems, it kind of goes into the discussion we've been having, like, lately on the channel about kind of systemic design, or allowing, like, elements and mechanics that can be used, in multiple ways, kind of leading to, like, that kind of emergent behavior. And
for sure, yeah.
I don't think, and as we've been like talking over this last like almost an hour, like it's a very, I think, interesting concept for these kinds of murder mystery or just like mystery-based games in general to like give the player tools that have these multiple purposes. But as we've said, I don't know if that technology exists or if it's readily available to implement into this kind of genre.
It definitely can be difficult, and even like just looking at our own development history and like the tools that will be cut from the player's arsenal, there's a certain line between I guess I see the spectrum as like a very like a linear story-driven games on this end, and I mean we say sandbox is on the other end, but sandbox is kind of in the middle, and there's just like a software tool like like a game engine or Microsoft Word on the other end, where it is very flexible and allows you to, it gives you so many systems and tools within it. But then it's amorphous. There is there can be so many possibilities with it, and that's interesting. But the balance for a mystery game that's I guess that was somewhat counterintuitive for me at the beginning was that to the extent that there are tools, they also still need to drive towards the same singular objective, true events, unless if the game is entirely embracing differing interpretations and subjectivity, which could have also been done instead. But I think if that were the case, then it would stop being a mystery game per se, because there's a certain desire to solve and certain commitment to objectivity at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think if there's any other major questions. And for chat, if you do have any questions regarding Lucifer Within Us, or the mystery genre, or just mystery design in general, please let us know. Let me see. I guess while I'm trying to think of anything, any other aspects of the design that we didn't touch on that you'd like to cover?
I want to talk about the demons actually,
okay.
And the fact that the player dives into the psychological space of each of the suspects, called the sanctums. And so one interesting thing that we ran into very early in development was that so I mentioned the three elements of an accusation: opportunity, means, and motive. And we found that motive was very, very tricky to establish, unless you have a diary type object in which the suspect confesses to that thing somewhere in the physical environment. But given everything else about the project, it was very hard to create a private personal space for a given suspect that the player will have relative difficulty accessing, because they are the investigator, right? They have every right to go in. It would be very, very cheesy to have a diary per character or whatever per every case. So we ended up embracing the elements of the setting, and so the demons provide a certain grounding for why a suspect is driven to commit a crime, and a space in which the player can discover the motive of the crime and not doubt that it is hearsay, or that it is unimportant, or that it is amorphous. So as much as possible, it is treated like other kinds of evidence. But
I think we lost you there for a second. Can you still hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so with the kind of as you said, we're using the demons as a way of grounding these stories, or at least grounding the narrative. I guess.
Yeah.
And I think you may have kind of answered this question already, but so when you are investigating the case, are there any I guess quote unquote interactions with these demons, or is it kind of the demon is the grand reveal, the turnabout moment in Phoenix Wright?
It's more so the latter, but not much about that has been really revealed yet, and so I'll leave that for the game's release.
Now,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, were you going to say something else? Or?
What I was going to say is the player does have an access to a record of demons, the demonology, and so they have rough descriptions about what each demon tends to do to a person, or what emotion or motive is tied to that demon, and so that's supposed to hint at which of the suspects might be the possessed, and what to do during the actual exorcism.
Okay. Now, speaking about the story, one thing that we didn't touch on, I just want to ask you about. I guess, what was the inspiration for the story for Lucifer Within Us?
Um, that's a tough one. I as far as I guess like overall like a narrative, creative like inspirations, Rashomon was a big one. So the classic Kurosawa movie in which like a murder happens in a forest, and each person involved in the incident tells a completely different story, and ultimately it's not clear what happened. Like even the most reliable account is flawed by the witnesses avarice, and so like there's a certain I guess disillusionment that happens at the end of that movie, and so I wanted to essentially like ask like within like as far as like the project's like central question, like can we ever know what happened? Like how do we like is it really possible to know like what happened between like two people, three people, and to the extent that people do harmful things to each other in that kind of private space, and why is that? And so like to tie this back to the demons and exorcism and so forth, the game's world assumes that a certain ethos in which humans will not kill voluntarily. People will not physically harm others unless true. We know that that's not true in our world.
I'm sorry, my headset kind of cut out there. I lost
it
the
still
last
cut out there?
10
Okay.
seconds.
Okay. But I don't know where that cut off, but I guess
you're saying humans wouldn't kill voluntarily.
Right. So like if there were a society in which there was such absolute control over like a social behavior that they were able to suppress explicit violent crime for an extended amount of time, does that really mean that whatever was driving people to hurt each other in the first place is actually gone, or is that just suppressed? Like where does that go? Those are kind of the questions that the narrative is exploring, and with the lens of someone who, like as much as possible, is able to see within people and discover the past as much as anyone possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing, like, as you're describing like the narrative, kind of like the main character game, that it sounds very interesting, is that like the person who's investigating these crimes is very much in control over like what's going on. Like this is not some bumbling for like Phoenix Wright where he's trying to get an answer from someone. They're like, no, I'm not going to tell you this. Like this very much sounds like somebody who is very much confident and kind of in control over what's going on.
Absolutely, and so one of the drives for this project was allowing the player to be Sherlock rather than Watson.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, as much as Phoenix is relatable and likable, to some degree, like he is intentionally designed to allow the player to feel smarter than he is, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, as a result, I don't feel as though I'm actually like on site and actually investigating, Whereas if we could make someone who's keen, who's thoughtful, who is confident, perhaps they may seem a little bit cold, but at the same time, that is in spirit of someone who could discover the truth, regardless of the circumstance.
Yeah, and there's always that, I think, that balance you have to make between making the character relatable and making somebody who you can very much believe this person could solve this murder. This person can sit there and deduce the whole thing. And we've seen that kind of archetype play out, especially on like TV and other video games, where you have the investigator with a horrible secret or is a complete jerk, but
Yep.
they just deal with them because they're the best damn investigator around.
Right, yeah, for sure. And I don't know if you were referring to Disco Elysium there, but like definitely like having a deeply flawed but still competent protagonist is one way to approach things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm trying to think. We've talked about that. We talked about the story. I guess one other question. I guess this is some basic logistics. Like, how long have you been working on Lucifer Within Us?
I think it's been a bit over 3 years now. I've become like starting from the very initial prototyping and concepting phase of the game, and yeah, it's changed a lot over the years, and I'm just really fascinated by what we've done and what we will continue to do, and super excited to get it to release and see what the players think.
Mm-hmm. So I think with that, I guess just like a few final, I guess, general wrap-up questions for you. And for the chat, this will be final call if you have any questions about Lucifer Within Us. Okay, yeah. Hopefully my headset will serve. Oop. There you go, I think I'm back. Yeah, my headset is possessed, as a shark said in chat. We'll see if it makes it. But
okay.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I remember, like, when we had our discussion about the Shroud Isle, like, we talked about kind of the unique design of that. Did anything, or did you learn, or like anything through developing the Shroud Isle, kind of infer when you developed Lucifer Within Us?
For sure. So I mentioned like a certain design motifs, and I feel carrying over from one project to the next. And the lineage between the Shrouded Isle and Lucifer, besides the religious aesthetics, if you will, is about information. So the interesting thing about the Shrouded Isle is the partial information, right? And so like a given character has certain traits, but you don't know fully what those traits are. And the discovery for about those traits, the discovery process for those traits, only reveals it little by little. And so at some point, in the middle of the game, you might know generally what that character might be like, but not to what extent. And so similar things apply here, in that the game would be trivial if everything was known at the beginning, but the game would be inscrutable if nothing was known at the beginning. And so the way the testimonies work is towing that line of partial information. And so you get a general sense of what could have happened, but at the same time, that's not the full truth, or even in certain sections are outright lying. And so you cross-check that against the testimonies of other characters and evidence to discover the truth. And so, I mean, you could see it as a far more a game dedicated to how the inquiries work from the Shrouded Isle. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but as far as explicit learnings from that game that carried over to Lucifer, partial information.
Okay. Yeah, I think, as you said, it's always that tricky balance of what information do you give the player. And I mean, that could easily apply to just about any game that we've played.
For sure, yeah.
We've played games where it's just literally drop the player off and just say, figure everything out on your own. Just as we said earlier with some of the other examples of mystery games, where it's basically, okay, click here, accuse this guy, you click this confession, click this evidence, you're done, you solve the case.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, and to some degree, especially with our game with a unique interface, so we needed to have a much more improved onboarding and tutorialization compared to our previous projects. But at the same time, there does need to be basically a space, a mystery space for the player to navigate and explore and discover for themselves, and as meaningfully as possible, as opposed to just a nominally wide, which would be what a text parser would do.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think with that, I guess Obviously, one question I'm sure everybody's wondering: is there an estimated release date for Lucifer?
Right. So there's I can't announce the specific date, but we are committed to finishing the game this year. So yeah, sometime this year we are going to release Lucifer.
Mm-hmm. And will it just be available on PC, or are you planning other platforms?
So currently we're confirmed for PC and OS X, and there's nothing confirmed for the other.
All right. Let me see. Anything else design-wise I want to ask? I think that's about it. I'm sure we kind of talked already about kind of the tutorials and the onboarding. I guess anything else interesting or challenging that came up with kind of designing how to teach someone to play this game?
Yeah, perhaps there's two things I would say. Mm-hmm. One is expressing to the player what can be trusted and to what extent that information can be trusted. And so what I've noticed that during a playtest, or at least in our earlier playtest, would be that initially the player will trust everything, and when they discover the conflicts between the suspect and their testimonies, they will have a moment in which they feel they can't trust anything.
Yeah.
And at that point, the possibility space, at least in the player's mind, is just absolutely wide. And one might think that's a good thing, but that also causes players to feel frustrated and completely lost as far as what to do next. Mm-hmm. And so we had to take some effort to create some subsystems that verify certain pieces of information. So, for example, if a statement is more specific than certain moment in time or certain action, as opposed to I was doing this all afternoon, then the player can trust that more so. Or if it's backed up by physical evidence, they really should trust that information. Or if it's backed up by something that the player has discovered in their soul, then that can also be trusted and so forth. So that's sort of a verification structure, or at least just as far as the player's relation to the information that they discover and their trust in it was difficult to teach. The other thing is somewhat just UX driven. Just in terms of teaching the player to present information was a bit difficult. So just by the nature of the game, some evidence is some information is physical, some information is temporal, some is psychological, and encouraging the player to treat them largely the same. It is just information, after all, that you are presenting to this character. And so encouraging that behavior was relatively difficult because each of these elements looks, in different stages of our UI development, look quite different. And trying to create a similar user flow for that unifies them was a challenge. But I think we have a decent solution in the current build.
Mm-hmm. And as you're describing that sense of either I trust everything or I trust nothing, it reminds me whenever we play a Metroidvania or an action-adventure game, when you find your first fake wall, and then from that point on you're just going to run to every wall you see, thinking that one of them is going to be a fake one. Right, for sure. And so in a Metroidvania's case, right, it's always a kind of a positive surprise, if you will. Hey, if you're unlucky, nothing happens. If you're lucky, you discover this bonanza. Great. But it's bound by physical space, right? Mm-hmm. In a given platform, there's a wall here, and you can hit that wall or not, and so forth. Whereas for a game that's focused so much on information and discovery, with an open-ended asking system, that possibility space can be quite large. And so I think I touched on that brute forcing earlier. Yeah. Some players do feel compelled to just try everything. Well, why not? It's free. There is no punishment. Yeah. And I don't think that's a fun way to play, but if that's what they want to do, I don't think we should punish them for it. Oh yes, I have certainly played many adventure games like that. Just again, take every item, and supposedly one of them will eventually solve the puzzle. And again, it gets back to that challenge of these kinds of games that the player may know the solution, but they don't have the proper means to present it. Or they have the means to present it, but they haven't made that connection yet. So, okay, this is the clue that's going to, crack this case wide open.
Right, for sure.
All right. But I think that with that, we are just about out at our time. Almost, we almost hit like the mark that we gave as our estimate, so we kind of kept things there. So
awesome.
I guess a final thing then for you then is, I guess first off, anything you want to end this cast on? Anything you want to say to the fans? The floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you so much for listening. And if any of what I described is of interest to you, please wishlist the game on Steam. And so our wishlist page for Lucifer Within Us should be up. And yeah, I would love to hear what you think or what you see there. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
And any social media you would like to plug before I let you go for today?
Follow us at Kitfox Games on Twitter.
All right. So, I think with that, we will end things for this cast. Jongwoo, it was a pleasure hanging out with you again, and definitely best of luck with Lucifer.
Thank you so much. Cheers, Josh.
All right. So, for those of you watching, we will be wrapping up our cast here. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to check out our Discord and Patreon link down below. We'll be back later tonight for our regular game streams. And if you are a developer working on an upcoming game and want to come on and chat with me, get in touch. We're always looking for guests. So, with that said, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until our next talk, have a great night. Take care.